Kunta Kinte was a young man from Jufure, in the Gambia, captured at just 17 years old. Born free, he was proud of his Mandinka heritage and determined never to forget who he was. But in 1767, he was seized by slave traders, chained and shipped across the Atlantic on the brutal Middle Passage. Sold into slavery in Maryland, he was beaten and forced to work on a plantation. When he refused to answer to the name Toby and insisted he was Kunta Kinte, his captors whipped him nearly to death. His defiance became legendary, symbolizing the struggle of millions who were stripped of their identities. Though generations passed, his story survived. Alex Haley, Kunta's descendant, brought his ancestors' journey to the world through the book Roots, ensuring Kunta Kinte's name would never be forgotten. Read the full story in the comments. After the U.S. banned the transatlantic slave trade in 1808, a horrifying industry rose in its place: slave breeding farms. Particularly in Virginia and Maryland, enslaved women were forced to bear children not for family, but for profit. Their bodies became tools of production. Slaveholders handpicked strong, obedient men, sometimes called studs, to father as many children as possible. These men were not sent to the fields. Instead, they were kept healthy, clean, and well-fed, used purely for reproduction. Enslaved women had no choice. Their pregnancies weren't seen as new lives, but new assets. Children born into this system were sold, traded, or raised to become laborers themselves. Some women were forced to give birth to over 10 children, not for love, but to grow a master's wealth. These breeding farms didn't disappear overnight. They left scars on descendants, on families torn apart, and on a nation still wrestling with its past. It only ended when slavery itself was abolished in 1865, with the ratification of the 13th Amendment. They were known as the Fancy Girls of New Orleans. Enslaved black women sold not for labor, but for exploitation. Traders marketed their beauty, dressing them in fine clothes and parading them through auction blocks where wealthy white men bid for control of their lives. These women were forced into relationships often promised freedom or social standing in exchange for obedience, but the reality was a life of exploitation and vulnerability. Some were sent to secret brothels, others kept as mistresses in so-called placage arrangements, where power always lay in the hands of their enslavers. Their suffering reveals a darker side of slavery, one where human beings were stripped of dignity and reduced to objects of desire. Though their names are rarely remembered, the story of the Fancy Girls exposes the cruel intersections of race, gender, and power in America's past. Do you think the stories of the Fancy Girls should be taught more openly in schools? Most people have heard about the Fancy Girls of New Orleans, enslaved women sold for beauty and exploitation, but few know there were fancy boys too. These were young, mixed-race men, enslaved, polished, and paraded for their looks and charm. They weren't sold for field work or labor, but for companionship, entertainment, and silent servitude. Traders dressed them in fine clothes, taught them manners, music, and conversation, then sold them to the wealthy elite of cities like New Orleans and Charleston. Some served as attendants or musicians. Others were forced into far darker roles, used and controlled behind closed doors, their suffering hidden beneath the veneer of Southern gentility. The fancy boys lived in a world that prized their appearance but denied their humanity. Their names rarely appear in history books, their pain buried in silence. We remember the fancy girls, but now, it's time to remember them too. Did you know about the fancy boys? This man's life was defined not by freedom but by the cruel economics of slavery. Known as Big Jake of Virginia, he was chosen for one reason alone: his body. Tall, strong, and imposing, he was forced into the role of a stud, valued only for his ability to father children. Jake was spared the brutal field labor that broke so many others, but his existence was no less violent. Enslaved men forced into this role were often paired with multiple women at a time, depending on the size of the plantation and the owner's ambitions. Jake was forced into hundreds of pairings over the years, women who had no choice, their bodies and futures controlled by enslavers who saw them as breeding stock. Jake himself had no choice either, his dignity stripped away, reduced to a tool for profit. Like the infamous Pata Seca in Brazil, Big Jake's story reveals the darkest side of slavery, where human lives became commodities, and even the most intimate bonds were manipulated for gain. If this shocked you, know that Big Jake's story is just one of many. Follow for more untold histories of humanity. This woman stood up to one of the most powerful politicians in America, while still enslaved. Her name was Charlotte Dupuy, and in 1829, she did something almost unthinkable. She sued her enslaver, Henry Clay, the U.S. Secretary of State, for her freedom. At a time when enslaved people had no legal standing, Charlotte filed a petition in Washington, D.C., demanding her liberty. She claimed that a previous owner had promised her freedom, and she was ready to fight for it. The case went to court, delaying her forced relocation to Kentucky. Though she ultimately lost, Charlotte remained in D.C. and was not returned to Clay for years. Even when finally sent to Kentucky, she was later freed in 1840, over a decade after her courageous legal stand. Her daughter Mary also gained her freedom, showing that Charlotte's resistance rippled across generations. And today, historians consider her lawsuit one of the earliest documented legal challenges by an enslaved woman in American history. Charlotte Dupuy didn't win her case, but she made history and helped pave the way for others who dared to demand justice. 1756, at 11 years old he was kidnapped from his home in West Africa and sold into the brutal system of transatlantic slavery. Known as Olaudah Equiano, he endured unimaginable hardship aboard slave ships, working tirelessly under harsh conditions while witnessing the horrors of the Middle Passage. He was first sold into slavery in Virginia, where his life as an enslaved child truly began. But unlike many enslaved people, Equiano was determined to change his fate. He was taken to England, where he began to see a different world and build the knowledge. He learned to read and write, carefully documenting his experiences and developing the skills to trade and save money. Eventually, he bought his freedom, a monumental achievement in a world designed to keep him in chains. Freed but never forgetting the suffering he endured, Equiano became a powerful voice for abolition. His autobiography, detailing the horrors of slavery and the humanity of its victims, became a bestseller and swayed public opinion in Britain. Through his words and speeches, he helped ignite a movement that would ultimately change the course of history. The life of Olaudah Equiano is unforgettable. Book link in the comments. Which part of his journey shocks you most? He was born into slavery, torn from his mother, forbidden to read and beaten for trying, but Frederick Douglass refused to be broken. He secretly taught himself to read and write, knowing that knowledge was power. He tried to escape more than once, and failed. But he never gave up. On September 3, 1838, disguised as a sailor, he boarded a train in Baltimore, making it to New York. But he didn't just run to freedom. He turned around and fought for others still in chains. Once free, he became a voice that thundered through America. His speeches exposed the cruelty of slavery, his words shook presidents, his autobiography sold thousands of copies, giving a face to the enslaved. He met with Lincoln, advised presidents, demanded justice for black Americans, both enslaved and free, and he never stopped using his pen and voice as weapons of truth. From slave to statesman, from bondage to the White House, Frederick Douglass didn't just escape, he became a legend. Which story did you connect with the most? Let us know in the comments.